And congratulations, Stavros. It's a great day for the European Union. You receiving this award today, and great work on the table in terms of the draft accord. Let me give a few words of introduction of possible thinking on such an accord. First, because AI is predicted to be pervasive in all areas of society as a useful tool, whether in the environment, education, health, security, and so on, one may be tempted to rewrite all the rules for society in such an accord. And that, of course, then leads to the necessary tolerance and relativism, which we find in very broad international agreements. And that would be the classic approach to respect all the diversities of countries, of views on how things should be going in this form of democracy or that form of democracy. Now, I would say we have an alternative in relation to AI due to the technical nature of the subject we are dealing with. What do I mean by this? The technical nature of the subject opens up parameters and categories on which I believe agreement is possible, very independent of the question of whether the signatory is a democracy or not, and whether a signatory has this or that security or economic interest or this or that fundamental right in place or not. So I think we should be first searching for those principles which will be useful to all in the world if we can get binding rules on this. And I will give you some examples on this. For example, because of the technical nature, because of the machine nature of AI, we want to be certain in the future that an AI system really does what it is supposed to do. And I would say that is one of those generic principles, which is on a sufficient high level of abstraction that everybody in this world could read. Or let me give another data. It should come reliable, so it should which is unbiased. Again, this is a principle on which I would think, I would like to hear those who say, well, but we have to have tolerance for those who may see this differently. So what I would encourage us to do in our ongoing work is to search together for those generic principles which are actually defining what is new in this international accord, rather than trying to rewrite all the general principles ranging from the balance between security and fundamental rights right through to sustainability in environmental affairs of all policy areas and of all world accords which may have existed in history. I think we should focus on the new challenge and the new specificities. And my prediction is if we do this, we will find principles on which agreement in a binding form is maybe more likely than on those agreements on which mankind has only in very rare, lucky occasions found the possibility to agree on binding rules. That would be my first remark. My second remark is relating to the reason why one would want to have such an agreement. Now, first, let me say that in contrast to the speaker I've just heard, in the European Union, of course, we have moved on. There was really a development of thinking, moving from first the thinking that the law is not, and binding rules are not amenable to be used for regulating such a technology. And this was the thinking which led the Commission to set up a high-level group on AI ethics. Also, the German government set up a high-level group on data ethics. And, all in all, we have around 80 ethics codes around the world today on AI. And I don't want to speculate on, who has put the money on this orientation on ethics rather than the law, and, for whom it was good and for whom it maybe wasn't. But one thing is clear, that in the European Union, the thinking has moved on from the conviction that ethics will be at the center as a tool. Of course, in terms of substantive principles, we want to act ethically, but the Union has moved on to start work on binding rules which are enforceable against everyone. And this is significant. Why is this significant? Because in contrast to some of the other speakers, we do believe that AI is so important in terms of its ubiquity, but also in terms of the power it gives to the state and to private parties, that we cannot only work with incentives, non-binding rules, and let's say all the instruments which we know from the OECD. So we already have an OECD code on AI principles to which many countries have agreed. We now have the work ongoing in UNESCO. We have work ongoing on some kind of global instrument in the Council of Europe, which is the broader European organization to which Russia and Turkey belong, and to the conventions of which the United States has also signed up on occasion. And you mentioned in your agreement, in a draft agreement, you mentioned the Budapest Convention. I would say we should be ambitious in our work and see in terms of what we aim for. We see that we aim for a binding international agreement of the type of the law of the sea, which contains important elements of a binding nature, and which includes also the instruments and institutions which are necessary to deal with binding rules and to make sure that binding rules are respected. Is it right, and this will be my last and third remark, is it right to take the multilateral agreement on the law of the sea, which is a United Nations agreement, as a model for our work on AI? The multilateral agreement on the law of the sea is the biggest binding convention of the United Nations. And I would say, having in mind the comments which we heard from our first speaker, namely the ambition to have as many countries on board as possible as a precondition for such an accord working, I think that makes the law of the sea a great model. Second, the law of the sea at the time was extremely innovative in dealing with a space which was largely unexplored out there beyond the site from the coast, 70% of the space of the world. And this was exactly the reason that states got together and agreed on, if you look at them today, amazing principles of a binding nature, because everybody understood that this new frontier, the ocean being at the beginning of exploitation, deep sea mining, and so on, needs common rules to avoid conflict in the future. And the United Nations and states went very far in this, even set up a court and a dispute settlement system, which today works fairly well. So I think we should have our ambitions high. We should go beyond just repeating non-binding types of principles, which we already find in the OECD code and in many ethics codes. We should focus on the specific nature of the technology, which provides us with the opportunity to set out principles on which agreement is possible. And we should aim for binding rules, because we are dealing with power relations here, power relations between states and private corporations. Let's not forget that those corporations which are at the forefront of operationalizing AI in terms of financial capacity are bigger than many states of this world. So I can imagine that many states actually have an interest in binding rules for this reason alone. And we're dealing with power relations between the states and individuals, not only individuals of the own country, and power relations between corporations which use AI and people. And since these power relations are one of the key reasons why we are dealing in a binding way with AI in legislation in the European Union, this would be my encouragement to our work, that we recognize that this element of managing power from technology and controlling power is one of the key challenges of the future and underlies our willingness to come together in this group and look for global principles which help us to give a frame to this new power over people, over states, over resources, over security. To close, I commend to everyone the new report from Bruce Schneier at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, came out this week, on AI as a hacking tool in the future. And he describes a world in which all binding principle, all decency, all systems of security which we may have in technical devices will be systematically undermined by AI systems which have been built for this purpose. So I do not believe that we need an agreement which becomes a marketing tool for AI. I do believe we underestimate the risks. And I do believe here we have another principle which we will find agreement on by many, namely that AI, which has this purpose as described by Bruce Schneier, should be outruled, namely AI which serves as a tool for criminal purpose. Thank you very much.